As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered,
"Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world."
And when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him,
"Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent.
Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it's somebody that looks like him." He kept saying,
"I am the man."
But they kept asking him, "Then how are your eyes opened?" And he answered,
"The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' And I went and washed and received my sight."
And they said to him, "Well, where is he?" And he said,
"I do not know."
So they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. And then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. And he said to them,
"He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see."
And some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. And so they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes that he opened." And he said,
"He is a prophet."
The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? And then does he now see?" And his parents answered,
"We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it was that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, for he is of age. He will speak for himself."
His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And that's why his parents said,
"He is of age, ask him."
And so for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." And he answered,
"I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see."
And they answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Now Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he answered,
"And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him."
And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." And he said,
"Lord, I believe."
And then he worshiped him.
Well, usually, I have to admit, I get kind of hung up on the miracle cure in this story, and I don't think about much else in it. But this week, I saw myself in this story in a way I never have before. Now, I know that one part of this story reassures us that Jesus opposes the belief that disabilities are caused by sin, and that can feel reassuring. But another part can give us pause, the part that some of us have used to suggest that God causes disabilities so that God can get glory by curing them. And based on some of what some of you have shared with me, I know I'm not alone in either of those honest reactions to those lines. And those are important things to talk through and to even wrestle with. But today, I want to tell you again about how this week I've come to recognize my own lifelong journey with Jesus in this story of this one day in this healed man's life. Not because I've ever been blind or experienced a cure that defied medical explanation, but because after this man is cured, we find him working his way towards fully understanding Jesus, step by step. Because it helps me to see, I'm getting used to being back in person here, skipping over lines. I really identify with that process this healed man goes through because it helps me to see what has happened in my own journey towards understanding Jesus. It helps give meaning to struggles I've had. It helps me to see God smiling on each part of my journey, even those parts that I couldn't see God smiling on at the time. And it affirms me and makes me want to affirm anyone out there whose journey might be like mine too, because I know many of us carry some pretty big questions about Jesus. Like, did Jesus really do and say what the Gospels ascribe to him? Or is everything Jesus said and did really a perfect example for us? Or can I really have a relationship with someone I can't even see or touch? In fact, not only do many of us carry questions like these, but there can often be a lot of shame in carrying these questions. We're not sure we should admit we have them. Maybe we have admitted them and we've been told harshly, or maybe even kindly, not to ever ask it again. And sometimes it's those kind ways of being told to zip it that can hurt the most, right? Or maybe nobody's ever needed to tell you that. You've just always known that there are certain questions you shouldn't ask in church. But today, I want this story to encourage us to be a different kind of church. Well, actually, in many ways, I know full well that we are already a different kind of church. So maybe to say it better, I want this story to encourage us to keep being that different kind of church. I want this story to encourage us to keep growing into being that kind of church. And I want this story to encourage us to know that we don't do this in spite of the Bible. We do this because stories like today's, when we're attentive to them, reveal to us that understanding Jesus isn't something we need to have all figured out at once, and that the big questions that come along the way aren't necessarily a big problem, but rather that Jesus is someone we understand better and better only by reflecting on him again and again, only by talking about him again and again, only by encountering him, even when we're still working it out, again and again. And only by doing all of these things really honestly. Even though sometimes there are some in the religious establishment who might act like they prefer that we didn't. Here's what I mean. I won't blame you if you missed what I'm going to talk about when you listen to the story right now. After all, even beyond those statements on sin and disability that I just mentioned, there's a ton of other attention-grabbing material in this story brought to life by Richard and Carolyn. There are judgy disciples. There's Jesus' spit being rubbed on someone's eyes, a cure for blindness, nosy neighbors, comically dumb leaders, uncomfortably unkind parents. Also, did I mention Jesus' spit being rubbed on someone's eyes? There's a lot vying for our attention here, right? But if we read past the obvious headlines and into the heart of this story, there's also this. In just a few paragraphs, the healed man in John 9 goes from describing Jesus as some man called Jesus, that's verse 11, to declaring that Jesus is a prophet, that's verse 17, to finally believing that Jesus is the Messiah referred to in Daniel, that's verse 38. On its most obvious level, this is a story about a man whose blindness is cured, and how, because his healing threatens people's sense of control and social standing, he gets into a lot of arguments about it. But on a subtler level, and no less important level, this is a story about a man's journey with Jesus, and how at first, he only partly understands who Jesus is, but then, as he reflects on that encounter again and again, speaking honestly along the way, and then meeting Jesus a second time, his understanding of Jesus grows until Jesus becomes God's own presence to him. The whole thing is a process so powerful that thankfully not even those loud local Bible thumpers trying to get him to be quiet can prevent it from happening. You see, in addition to this being another story of healing, and in addition to this being another story of Jesus' life-giving power confronting the life-limiting powers of the establishment, this is also the story of one person figuring out who Jesus is, step by step, as he honestly tells his story, no matter how many others try to stop him from telling it. So let's take a look at each of those steps. And along the way, at each step, I'd like to tell you about some of the steps in my journey towards understanding Jesus. Because I wonder if, even though no journey with Jesus is identical, some of you might be able to relate. Let's find out. Right after Jesus touches his spit to the dirt, and then touches that spit mud goop to the man's eyes, and the man washes it off and he can see, the neighbors challenge him. How did this happen? A man called Jesus made mud and spread it on my eyes, the man replies, which means his understanding of Jesus is this right now. There was a man, his name was Jesus. At this point, when it comes to Jesus' identity, the healed man is keeping it to the provable facts. There was someone who was a man. That man went by the name of Jesus. That's it. Just the facts. You know, I could still remember one of the moments when I lost some of my childhood innocence about Jesus. I was driving through Winnipeg with my dad through another part of town we didn't go too often, when I remember what I saw as a prominent war memorial in a church cemetery. I was confused. Dad, I asked, why could a church have a statue about a war in its cemetery? Didn't Jesus say we weren't supposed to do that? Well, my dad responded, who was excellent in these teachable moments, not every church believes the same things about Jesus that we do. It was, as I remember it, the moment I learned that there was more going on with this Jesus guy than I'd ever realized. One of his supposedly most important teachings wasn't even agreed upon by everyone. How could that be? I didn't know it yet, but my list of how could it be questions about Jesus was only going to get longer. In the following years, I would come to learn that not everyone even believed in Jesus the way we did. As I reached puberty, I'd start to get the sense that there were people out there who seemed to have evidence that they said contradicted the stories I'd learned about Jesus. By the time I reached college, I would be starting to feel bombarded by the questions about Jesus, too obvious to be ignored anymore, that I could see being raised by historians and scientists alike. And it would have been around this time in my life that, had you asked me what I really knew about Jesus, I might have said, there was a man, his name was Jesus. I'm not sure what else I think beyond that. In fact, I remember privately admitting to at least one friend that it only seemed a matter of time before I'd land in the Unitarian Universalist Church, which is wonderful, by the way, but where I hoped I didn't need to be sure of anything more than that about Jesus to fit in. And yet, even as I had my doubts, many, many doubts, I kept being asked to think and talk about Jesus. I kept being invited to places where Jesus was purported to be. Not only that, but the adults in my life kept giving me leadership roles in those communities. I was asked to be a residence assistant in the dormitory at my Mennonite high school. I was asked to preach in church. I was shoulder tapped to help lead committees that planned retreats for Mennonites in my whole local province and across North America. I became a director and then a Bible instructor at Camp Assiniboia. I became the youngest person I'd ever heard of to serve on the Mennonite Church Manitoba board. I was invited to come back and teach at the Mennonite high school I'd graduated from. There was a man, his name was Jesus, and there were days, lots of days, when had you asked me to account for it all, that's all I was sure I could tell you. But for whatever reason, the invitations for me to continue to think sincerely about Jesus, to be real in Jesus' places, were relentless. Speaking of relentless, back in today's story, the healed man's neighbors, relentless in a much less inviting way, drag him before the Pharisees to try to get him to fix his story. But the Pharisees are lost on what to do. They finally just ask, "It was you whose eyes he opened. What do you say about him?" And this time, having had more time to think about Jesus, having reviewed and told the story of his encounter with Jesus a second time, the man says, "He's a prophet." Do you see what's changed? In the first part of the story, the man isn't saying more than that there was a man and his name was Jesus. Now, with more time to sit with it and a second round of sharing about his experience with Jesus, he has declared Jesus to be a prophet. He's not saying Son of God. He's not saying Savior. He's not saying Messiah. Jesus isn't more than human, according to a statement like that. But he sure is a pretty important kind of human. The top echelon of humans, in fact. Elijah was a prophet. Moses was a prophet. There was a man. His name was Jesus. He was clearly one of the really, really good ones. You know, when I was in my 20s, wondering what to do with Jesus, there was a book I had on my bedside table, and I lugged around in my backpack when I went on trips. Like many of the books I didn't have to read for college at that time, and even some that I did, I'm not sure I really read all of that book. So as much as I kind of read parts of it and then kept it close by, I hoped it would maybe transfer something to me via osmosis. And I guess it kind of worked, because the book has left its mark. Some of you may know it. It was a Philip Yancey book called Soul Survivor, and it told the story of how Yancey's faith in Jesus was essentially saved by the examples of Christians like Martin Luther King Jr., Annie Dillard, Henry Nouwen, and 10 others. Whether or not I actually read all of the book, I kept it around because it symbolized something I was clinging to. That maybe Jesus had something to say to me through the Gospels that I needed to hear. That maybe Jesus could help me to be more like those people I really admired. There were now days, a number of days, when I know I could certainly have said this. There was a man, his name was Jesus. He must have been one of the really, really good ones, up there with people like Martin Luther King Jr., Annie Dillard, and Henry Nouwen. Some days that's all I could have told you for sure at that point in my life, but for whatever reason, on top of the invitations for me to continue to be myself in Jesus' places and to talk honestly about Jesus with people who showed their love for me, the books about Jesus were accruing. They were piling up on my bedstand, and more importantly, the thinking about Jesus I kept finding myself doing was pretty much relentless. Well, speaking of relentless once again, at the end of today's story, Jesus comes to visit the healed man a second time. He's heard about the healed man's plight. And which went on to include rejection from his own parents and another judgy grilling from the Pharisees, during which time the man continued relentlessly to talk honestly about his experience with and his thoughts on Jesus. And now, having come back to visit this man again, Jesus tells him, I am the Son of Man. Which is very different, actually, than when the healed man originally just said that Jesus was a man. Because the Son of Man is a very specific reference to a passage from the book of Daniel that some Jewish people in Jesus' time thought referred to the Messiah. A human who would be the ultimate gift from God. A human we now understand who would be God in the flesh, right there with him. And so now the healed man worships Jesus as God with him. He agrees that Jesus is the Messiah. At the end of it all, having gone from being able to say simply, there was a man, his name was Jesus, to there was a man, his name was Jesus, he was one of the really, really good ones, the healed man now, after all this time to consider it, after talking honestly about his experience again and again, even before he had it all figured out, now, with yet another encounter with Jesus under his belt, with Jesus having come compassionately to check on him, now he's all in, saying, there was a man, his name was Jesus. He's one of the really, really good ones. In fact, he's born from God. Through him, God was with me. You know, the other night, I was reading bedtime stories to Ollie, and we started chatting about God, which is sometimes something we do at bedtime. Ollie, of course, is still at that innocent stage of faith, the one I think I was at before I saw that confounding war memorial in that church cemetery. And while I know he's got so much of his own journey with Jesus ahead of him, a journey full of questions, probably some doubts, but hopefully also people who keep asking him to share honestly about his journey with Jesus and who keep inviting him into Jesus' spaces, there sure is something to be said about knowing Jesus through the eyes of a child who has yet to go through all of that. And always given me permission to share this story too, just so you know. I don't know how it came up, but I remember something came up that made it only natural for me to ask, do you find it easy or hard to know that God exists? And Ollie said, cool as the breeze coming through his window, oh, it's easy. I've heard God in the wind. I don't hear it all the time, but there's a kind of wind I hear. It's God. Which immediately transported me back to something I knew I'd never told Ollie about, but now proceeded to. You know, when I was in those crucial, conflicted college years and beyond, trying to understand Jesus, I noticed this strange thing that kept happening. In those years, it must have been popular to encourage young Christians to just sit in silence, because I remember that a lot of the Jesus places I went to during those years had me do that. And I remember that each time I did it, I'd usually at first feel accosted by some of the angst and anxieties I was carrying. One time I remember doing it, it was definitely right after a big argument I'd had with my girlfriend at the time. But I remember these times of sitting alone in silence, usually angsty, and I always started thinking, well, I don't feel anything. This only seems to be confirming my fears that there really isn't a Jesus who invisibly relates to me. And then, time and again, I would notice, guess what? The wind. I would notice the wind in a way I would otherwise not notice it. And with it, the angst would lift away, and, for example, the right thing to say to patch things up with my girlfriend might come to mind. Or a reassurance in the form of another thought, or a Bible story, or a verse would come to me, and I would look it up. But more than anything, in that breeze, in the wind, I would know. I would really, really know in those moments, God is with me. Which, of course, is one of the names for Jesus. Emmanuel. God is with us. There was a man. His name was Jesus. He was one of the really, really good ones. And even if I'd had to earn this understanding the hard way, thanks to the wind, thanks to so much more than I have time to tell you about today, like all those Jesus spaces I was invited into and all those people who invited me there so warmly, and a rainbow answering a prayer on a terrifying hike through a glacial mountain pass, which I told you about once, and the transcendent connection I felt across chasms of difference with people, and the delight that comes again and again when now, as a pastor, I have to confront a Bible story I've sometimes feared, only to have that story open up to me and say something beautiful, and so much more. Thanks to all of that, I can also say, I have felt God with me. I have felt Jesus as the Son of God. There was a man, his name was Jesus. He was one of the really, really good ones. Through him, I know that God is with me. And so, on the other side of that, and as I only continue to understand and encounter Jesus even more, and to do so much of it with you, I now pray that God will give me, that God will give us as a church family, the grace to do better than the healed man's neighbors, parents, and local religious leaders, that we would honor the journey that each of us is on with Jesus, that we would keep inviting each other and others to come join us in this Jesus place, wherever each person may be at right in that moment in their understanding of Jesus. I pray that we might be the place where you are invited to come, and that you know you are safe to come when you might be saying, even if very quietly or indirectly, especially at first, I've been thinking about this moment in my life where I feel like Jesus may have touched my life. I don't know. It's all still kind of muddy. What I still see still seems a little blurry. But I want to unpack what I've experienced and what I'm thinking, and I'm looking for a place where I can be open with you and see what I might honestly start to see more of. Is this that place? May we, with the encouragement of the healed man in John cheering us on, may we continue to be that place.